The year I finally said it out loud, my mother was standing at the kitchen sink, hands still in the dishwater, and she did not turn around. I had chosen that moment carefully. The house was quiet, my aunt had taken the kids to the park, my father was in the garage. It was just the two of us, the way it almost never was anymore. And I actually thought this was the moment, that she would turn around, that she would dry her hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle, and she would come to me, and she would say the thing I had been waiting 22 years to hear her say. She did not turn around. What she said, still facing the window, still watching the backyard where nothing was happening, was, "Renata, Thanksgiving is in 4 days." That was it. That was the whole sentence. Not a question, not a rebuttal, not even a denial, just a calendar fact, delivered to the window, as if I had told her the dishwasher was broken, as if I had said something mildly inconvenient that she simply did not have time to address right now. I have spent a long time trying to find a more generous interpretation of that moment. I have tried, genuinely, to believe she was in shock, that she needed time, that the words hadn't fully landed yet. I tried to believe all of that for much longer than was good for me. But here is what I know now, and what I want you to hold on to from the very beginning of this story. My mother heard me. She heard every word. And her first thought was the seating chart. Now, if you want to know what happened next, and I promise you do, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell. Because around here, we don't skip the part where she finally stops being careful. And this one ends somewhere none of them saw coming. Let's keep going. My name is Renata. I am 41 years old. I teach art to 12-year-olds who are still young enough to believe that what they make matters, and I try very hard to protect that belief in them for as long as I possibly can. I live 40 minutes from the town I grew up in, close enough to drive back for holidays, far enough to breathe in between. I have one daughter. Her name is Petra. She is 17. She has my eyes. And that matters more to this story than almost anything else I am about to tell you. The man this story is about, I will call him Douglas, has been at every Thanksgiving I can remember since I was 9 years old. He is my mother's brother-in-law. Family without being blood. All of the access and none of the accountability. He is 68 now. He has a laugh that carries through walls. Over the years, he paid for my cousin Delia's car repairs, floated my Uncle Raymond through a bankruptcy, and bought my grandmother's assisted living facility an industrial television set that everyone agreed was extremely generous. He is very good at being generous in front of people. What Douglas did to me did not happen all at once. That is the first thing I want you to understand. Because I think we have all been taught to imagine this kind of story as a single, terrible event with a clear beginning and a clear end. Something you could point to on a timeline and say, there, that is where it started, that is where it stopped. It does not work that way. It is not a line, it is a tide. It comes in so gradually that by the time the water is at your chin, you have forgotten what dry land felt like. You have started to wonder if you were ever dry at all. I was 9 when I first understood that something about the way Douglas looked at me was different from the way the other adults did. I was 12 when I understood what that difference meant. I was 14 the first time I told someone, my friend Carrie, at a sleepover, whispering it into the dark above her bedroom ceiling. And she went very quiet, in a way that told me she believed me. It was the last time either of us ever brought it up. I was 41 years old, standing in my mother's kitchen, when I finally said it to the person who was supposed to have protected me from it. And she told me not to ruin Thanksgiving. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because before we get to the kitchen, before we get to my mother's hands in the dishwater and the thing she said to the window, there is something you need to understand about how Douglas Merritt built his safety net. How carefully, how patiently, how many people he made sure would owe him something before I ever opened my mouth. Because that is the part that almost worked. Douglas Merritt did not become untouchable by accident. I want you to understand that. Because one of the most disorienting things about surviving someone like him is the moment you realize that what felt like your personal nightmare was, for him, a managed operation. He was not reckless. He was not careless. He built something, deliberately, over decades. And what he built was a family that could not afford to see him clearly. It started with money. It always starts with money, or something that functions like it. Douglas had married into modest wealth. My Aunt Patricia's family had owned a small regional insurance company that her father sold in the late 80s. And Douglas had the particular gift of making everyone around him feel that proximity to that money was a privilege he was personally extending to them. He did not write checks for cousins in trouble because he was generous. He wrote checks because debt is a leash, and Douglas understood that better than anyone I have ever known. By the time I was a teenager, nearly every adult in that family had taken something from him. A loan, a favor, a phone call to someone who owed Douglas a phone call, my Uncle Raymond's bankruptcy, my Aunt Delia's son's DUI that somehow never made it to a courtroom, my own father, quiet, conflict avoidant, the kind of man who believed that not making trouble was a form of love, had borrowed $11,000 from Douglas in 1987 to cover a gap between jobs. He paid it back, every cent. But Douglas had a way of reminding people of things they thought were finished. This is the architecture of a man like Douglas. He does not build walls, he builds obligations. And then, when the moment comes that someone might say something that threatens him, he does not have to say a word. The walls build themselves. Everyone who owes him something does the work without being asked, because protecting Douglas means protecting the version of the family that Douglas makes possible. I understood none of this when I was 9. I understood fragments of it by the time I was 19 and left for college with 2 bags and a bus ticket and a feeling I could not name yet. That feeling of your lungs finally remembering what full capacity was. I understood most of it by my mid-30s, in a therapist's office in a beige building off a highway I took to work, when a woman named Dr. Hollis drew a circle on a piece of paper and started putting names in it, and asked me to tell her who I could call if something happened to me at 3 a.m. I got to 7 names before I realized that 5 of them had Douglas's phone number in their contacts, that 3 of them had been to his house for dinner within the last year, that 2 of them would, without malice, without even knowing they were doing it, find a way to make whatever I said about him a question of my reliability rather than his behavior. I crossed them off one by one. What I was left with was Marcus. Marcus Webb is my cousin on my father's side. No blood connection to the Merritts, no financial entanglement with Douglas, and enough of his own family estrangement that he had spent years at the comfortable edges of holiday gatherings rather than their center. 12 years before the kitchen moment, at a 4th of July barbecue, I had said something to Marcus. Not everything, a fragment. A single sentence that I immediately softened into something that could be reinterpreted as a misunderstanding if his face did the wrong thing. His face did not do the wrong thing. He put down his drink. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "Renata, I believe you. What do you need?" I told him I needed him not to do anything, that I wasn't ready, that it would make things complicated in ways I couldn't manage yet. And Marcus, because he respected me, because he understood that telling someone is not the same as being ready for the consequences, he said, "Okay." He held it. For 12 years, he held it. He told me later that not doing more was the thing he carried. That there were nights he thought about Douglas at that table, laughing that laugh, and he'd go over and over it. What he should have done, what he could have done, whether respecting my wishes had been the right call or the convenient one. I told him he made the call I asked him to make. I told him it was mine to carry, not his. But I think about that a lot. How the women who survive men like Douglas are always the ones doing the carrying. We carry the secret to protect the family. We carry the silence to protect ourselves. We carry the weight of other people's comfort until the morning we simply cannot pick it up anymore. That morning, for me, was the October before Thanksgiving. I had driven back to my hometown for a reason that had nothing to do with Douglas, a high school friend's gallery opening, 40 minutes from my apartment, the first time in 2 years I had let myself go back for something that was just for me. I was in the parking lot of a gas station off the 9, sitting in my car eating a gas station sandwich because I'd left too early for dinner, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Petra, and what that text said, what my 17-year-old daughter had quietly typed and sent to me while I was eating a terrible turkey sandwich in a gas station parking lot 40 minutes from the town I had fled at 19, changed the temperature of everything. I want you to hold on to that. Hold on to the parking lot, the sandwich, the October light, because this is where the story actually begins. The text from Petra said 4 words. Mom, he did it. That was all. 4 words. No punctuation after the period. The way you type something when your hands are not entirely steady and you need to get it out before you lose your nerve. I sat in that parking lot for a long time. The sandwich was on the passenger seat. The October light was doing something very beautiful to the tree line across the road. And I remember thinking, distantly, that I should look at it, that I should look at something beautiful, because I did not yet know how long it would be before beautiful things felt accessible again. I called her immediately. She picked up on the first ring. Petra is not a dramatic person. She has my precision and her father's economy of language. She does not perform emotion. She reports it, cleanly, the way you'd describe weather. When she spoke, her voice was steady, measured. The steadiness of someone who has already passed through the worst of it and is now simply in the business of telling the truth. She told me what had happened at my Aunt Patricia's house 3 days earlier, during a family dinner I had declined to attend. She told me what Douglas had said to her, in the hallway outside the downstairs bathroom, when he thought no one was nearby. She told me exactly how he had touched her shoulder, exactly what words he had used, the particular register of his voice, that low, warm, confiding tone I recognized from somewhere very deep and very old inside my own body. She said, "I know what that is, Mom. I know because you told me what to look for." I had told her. Not everything. She was not mine to burden with everything. But I had told her, carefully, over years, in the language of safety and instinct, and you are allowed to trust your own discomfort. I had handed her the vocabulary I had never been given, and she had used it. She had named what she felt immediately and without apology, and then she had texted her mother. She was 17 years old. She was 17 years old, and she did in 3 days what it took me 22 years to do. I drove home with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and that very specific kind of clarity that only arrives when there is absolutely nothing left to lose. I need to step outside this story for just a moment, because I have been sitting with Renata's story for a long time now. And there is something her daughter did, that single text, those 4 words, that I cannot stop thinking about. We talk a lot on this channel about the women who survive, about the long game, the documentation, the elegant, quiet justice. And all of that is real. All of that matters. But what Petra did was something else. Petra did not survive it and then speak. She spoke while it was still happening. She named it in real time, without 20 years of therapy and distance and carefully constructed language. She was 17, and she said, "I know what this is." And she said it because someone had loved her enough to teach her the words. If you have a daughter, or a niece, or a student, or any girl in your orbit who trusts you, I want you to think about what vocabulary you are giving her. Not warnings, not fear. Words. The specific, unambiguous words for when something feels wrong. The permission to trust that feeling without needing anyone else to validate it first. Renata could not protect her 9-year-old self, but she protected her daughter. And that is its own kind of justice. The quiet, unglamorous, profoundly important kind. Okay, back to the kitchen, back to Douglas, back to what Renata did next. Because what she did next is extraordinary. I called Marcus that night. He answered on the second ring. I told him everything, not the softened version, not the fragment I had handed him 12 years ago at the 4th of July with the immediate retreat into, "Don't do anything yet." All of it, the full timeline. What Douglas had done to me, what Douglas had just attempted with Petra, the 22 years of maintenance I had performed on that family's comfort at the direct expense of my own. Marcus was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "Tell me what you need." Same 4 words, 12 years later. Some people are just built like that. What I needed, I told him, was a week. I needed 7 days before I said anything to anyone else in that family. I needed 7 days because I had spent 22 years doing things without a plan, and I was not about to make that mistake now. Marcus said, "Whatever you need, I'll be here." What neither of us knew, what I am about to tell you now because you deserve to see it clearly even though Renata could not yet, is what Douglas was doing during that same week. He was not sitting still. Douglas Merritt had been managing information about himself for decades. He had a system. The system was simple. Whenever he sensed tension building around him, and he was exquisitely attuned to tension the way all erosive people are. He got to the room first. He did not wait for the accusation. He filed the narrative. 2 days after Petra's text, before Renata had said a single word to anyone in her family, Douglas called my mother. I know this because my mother told me later. Not intentionally, not as an admission, but in the way guilty people sometimes reveal things sideways, in the middle of an argument about something else entirely. Douglas called my mother and told her that he was worried about Renata, that he had noticed she seemed, his word, destabilized, that he had heard through the family grapevine that she had been going through a difficult period, and he just wanted Carol to know that he was available, as always, if there was anything the family needed from him. He did not mention Petra. He did not mention the hallway, he did not mention the shoulder or the words or the low, warm voice. He mentioned none of it, because he was seeding the field. By the time Renata arrived in that kitchen, by the time she said what she said to her mother's back, Douglas had already been there. He had already placed his version in the room. He had already made sure that when Renata's truth arrived, it would land in soil he had personally prepared. And my mother, who loved me, who I believe genuinely loved me, had already, without knowing she was doing it, begun the work of deciding which version of her daughter she could afford to believe. That is what makes what happened in that kitchen so unbearable and so important. Let me take you into that kitchen now. It is the Sunday before Thanksgiving, 4 days out. The house smells the way my mother's house always smells in November. Something with cinnamon, something with old wood. The particular warmth of a home that has been inhabited by the same person for 31 years. I had driven the 40 minutes with my hands steady on the wheel and a document open on my phone that I had spent 3 nights writing. Not an accusation, a timeline. Dates, incidents, descriptions, written in the precise, unadorned language I had learned from Dr. Hollis, who had once told me that the most powerful thing a woman can do is remove her emotion from her evidence without removing her truth from it. I had not yet decided whether to show my mother the document. I thought maybe I would not need to. I thought maybe if I just said it, plainly, clearly, without softening, the words themselves would be enough. I had forgotten who I was talking to. My mother, Carol Calloway, is 67 years old. She grew up in a family where conflict was not resolved, it was absorbed. You took the difficult thing and you pressed it down into yourself, and you kept the surface smooth, because the surface was what everyone could see, and what everyone could see was what mattered. She married my father for love and stayed for stability, and built a life on the premise that if you just kept things manageable, if you just kept people comfortable, the difficult things would eventually stop being difficult. She is not a cruel woman. I want to be precise about that, because this story is not about a cruel woman. It is about something harder than cruelty. It is about a woman who loved her daughter and loved her peace, and when those two things came into direct conflict, chose, without fully understanding she was choosing, her peace. I said what I said. Standing in her kitchen while she stood at the sink. I said it clearly. I used the specific words. I did not soften them, and I did not perform them. I simply placed them in the room and waited. She did not turn around. Renata, Thanksgiving is in 4 days. The silence after that sentence had a particular quality I have tried many times to describe. It was not the silence of shock. It was not the silence of a woman absorbing something too large for an immediate response. It was administrative. It was the silence of someone running calculations, of someone measuring the cost of belief against the cost of disruption and arriving, very quickly, at an answer she could live with. I said, "Mom, I need you to hear what I just told you." She turned around then, dried her hands on the dish towel, looked at me with an expression I had seen before. Not anger, not disbelief, but something more devastating than either. A kind of careful, sorrowful distance. The face of someone who has decided in advance that whatever comes next is going to be very difficult for them personally. She said, "I hear you, Renata. I don't know what you want me to do with this. Douglas has been part of this family for 30 years. Your Aunt Patricia, if I go to her with something like this right now, you don't know what that would do to her. And he has been so good to this family. You know what he did for Raymond. You know what he—" I stopped listening somewhere around, "You know what he did for Raymond." Not because I was surprised, but because Douglas had told me, without ever being in that room, exactly what my mother would say. He had handed her the script weeks in advance, and she had learned her lines without knowing she was in a production. I left my mother's house with the document still on my phone. I sat in my car in her driveway for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock. And then I called Marcus and I said 3 words. I'm done waiting. I have to stop here for just a second. Because if you are watching this and something in that kitchen scene just settled somewhere in your chest, that specific, suffocating feeling of saying the true thing and watching someone calculate their way out of believing you, drop a heart in the comments. You don't have to explain it. You don't have to say anything else. Just let me know you're here. Okay, back to Renata. Back to what she did after she stopped waiting. Marcus had, over 12 years of holding Renata's secret, developed his own quiet archive. He was not a dramatic person either, but he was, by profession, a civil litigation paralegal. He understood documentation the way Renata understood color theory, instinctively, structurally, as a language. When Renata called and said she was done waiting, Marcus said, "Good, because I've been ready for a while." What Marcus had, that Renata did not yet know about, was a conversation, singular, from 8 years earlier. A holiday gathering, Christmas, not Thanksgiving, her aunt's house in Millbrook, where Douglas, comfortable in his own territory, 3 glasses of wine into the evening, had said something to Marcus in the kitchen that Marcus had written down in his phone the moment Douglas walked away. He had written it down and saved it and never told Renata because she had asked him not to act. But he had known, with the bone certainty of a man who understands evidence, that the moment she was ready, the note would matter. What Douglas had said 8 years ago, 3 glasses of wine in, believing himself entirely safe, was not a confession in the legal sense. It was something more slippery than that, a reference, a joke that was not a joke. The kind of thing a man says when he has been protected for so long that he has started to believe his own invulnerability. It was the kind of thing that, placed alongside a timeline, alongside Petra's account, alongside 22 years of documented incidents, became something a lawyer would look at very carefully. And Renata, who had spent 30 years being an artist, who saw everything, who had been quietly cataloging without realizing that's what she was doing, had just opened the drawer. Douglas Merritt had 4 days until Thanksgiving. He believed the field was seeded. He believed Carol had done the necessary work. He believed, as he had believed for 30 years, that the architecture he had built would hold. He did not know about the drawer. He did not know about Marcus's note. And he did not know, could not have known, because he had never once considered her worth the consideration, that Petra had not only texted her mother, she had also texted a school counselor. 3 days before Renata ever walked into that kitchen. When a minor tells a licensed school counselor that an adult has behaved toward them in a sexually inappropriate way, the counselor does not get to decide whether to report it. That is not a choice. That is not a conversation. That is not something that gets weighed against family dynamics or holiday schedules or 30 years of goodwill built on other people's gratitude. It is a legal obligation, mandatory, automatic. The moment those words leave a child's mouth and enter the ears of a mandated reporter, the clock starts. And no one in that family, not Douglas, not my mother, not my Aunt Patricia with her careful, sorrowful distance, no one gets to stop it. Petra had known this. She had known because Renata had told her. Not as a strategy. Renata had not been thinking in strategies when she sat her daughter down years earlier and talked to her about bodies and boundaries and the specific, unglamorous mechanics of institutional protection. She had told her because a mother who survived what Renata survived does not send her child into the world without a map. Petra had drawn her own route. The counselor's name was Miss Okafor. She had been at Petra's school for 6 years. She was, by every account, precise and warm in equal measure. The kind of professional who makes you feel that the system, occasionally, works the way it was designed to. She had listened to Petra for 45 minutes on a Wednesday afternoon, asked careful questions, taken careful notes, and then explained, gently but without apology, what happened next. Child Protective Services received the report on a Thursday. Renata found out on a Friday, not from the school, not from CPS, but from Petra herself, who called her mother that evening and said, in her measured weather report voice, "Mom, I told Miss Okafor. She had to report it. I wanted you to know before anyone else called you." I have thought about that phone call many times, about what it costs a 17-year-old to make that sequence of decisions, to speak, to report, to then call her mother and deliver the information with such deliberate calm. Petra is not a fearless person. She was terrified. She told Renata later that she had sat in the school bathroom for 20 minutes after leaving Miss Okafor's office, breathing through it before she could walk back to class. But she walked back to class. She was terrified and she did it anyway. And I think that is the most important sentence in this entire story. The call Renata had been dreading, the one from a number she didn't recognize, with an area code that turned out to be a CPS intake worker, came on a Saturday morning. She had been expecting it. She answered on the first ring. The intake worker was professional and thorough. She explained the process. She asked questions Renata had not been asked before, in language that was clinical and careful and utterly without judgment. She asked about Renata's own history. Renata told her. She asked whether Renata had documentation. Renata said yes. She sent the timeline that night. 22 years, organized chronologically, written in the language Dr. Hollis had taught her. Specific, unadorned, stripped of interpretation. Just dates, incidents, descriptions. The kind of document that reads like weather. Like simple, devastating meteorology. Marcus sent his note separately. 8 years old, time-stamped, exactly as he had typed it into his phone the moment Douglas walked out of that kitchen in Millbrook. 1 paragraph. Douglas's words, verbatim, in quotation marks, followed by 3 lines of context. The date, the location, the blood alcohol estimate Marcus had noted because he understood, even then, that context was everything. Put those 2 documents side by side, and what you have is not a feeling. What you have is not a woman's word against a man's legacy. What you have is a pattern, documented, time-stamped, corroborated. A pattern is a very different thing from a complaint. Thanksgiving came anyway. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because the world does not pause for your reckoning. The holiday still arrives. The turkey still needs to be somewhere. My mother still set the table. I know because my cousin Delia texted me a photo of the centerpiece, some kind of dried flowers in small gourds, the caption reading, "Wish you were here," with a pumpkin emoji, as if nothing had happened. As if the ground beneath that table had not already begun to shift in ways none of them could feel yet. I did not go. For the first time in 41 years, I did not go to Thanksgiving. Petra and I ordered Vietnamese food and watched 3 episodes of a British baking show, and I cried twice. Not from grief exactly, but from the specific relief of sitting in my own living room on a Thursday in November without having to manage my face for a single moment. Douglas was at the table. I know because Douglas was always at the table. He did not yet know the full shape of what was moving toward him. CPS investigations do not announce themselves in advance. They do not send a courtesy calendar notification. But I have thought about him sitting there. The laugh that carries through walls, the glass raised, the particular comfort of a man who has never once sat at a table where someone was brave enough to make him uncomfortable. That was his last Thanksgiving at that table. The investigation took 11 weeks. I will not walk you through all 11 weeks, because some of what happened in them belongs to Petra, not to me. And there are parts of her story that are hers to tell or not tell as she chooses, in her own time, in her own words. What I will tell you is this. CPS substantiated the report. The language of that determination, substantiated, is clinical and small for what it means. What it means is they looked at everything. They interviewed everyone. They weighed the documentation, the corroboration, Marcus's note, Renata's timeline, Petra's account, and the accounts of 2 other women who came forward during the investigation. Women Renata had never met, who had their own drawers, their own timelines, their own years of carrying things they had been told were too inconvenient to put down. 2 other women. Douglas had been very, very careful for a very, very long time. But careful is not the same as singular. And the thing about a man who has been doing this across decades is that the decades accumulate. The women accumulate. And at some point, the weight of all that accumulation exceeds the architecture he built to contain it. My Aunt Patricia filed for divorce in January. Not because she wanted to. I do not think, even now, that she fully believed everything. Or perhaps she believed it in the way you believe something that is simply too large to be absorbed all at once. So you take it in the only portion size you can manage, which is enough. Enough to file. Enough to change the locks. Enough to stop setting his place at the table. My mother called me in February. She did not apologize. I want to be honest about that, because this story is not going to give you the apology scene, and I think you deserve to know that in advance so you can prepare yourself. What she said was, "I should have turned around." 6 words, delivered in a voice I had never heard her use before, stripped of the careful management, the surface maintenance, just the bare, exhausted sound of a woman who had finally put something down that she had been carrying for a very long time in the wrong direction. I should have turned around. I held the phone for a long moment, and then I said, "I know." Not "it's okay," not "I forgive you," just "I know." Because I did know. I had known for 22 years that she was capable of turning around. The tragedy was never that she couldn't. The tragedy was that she calculated, in the space of a single sentence about Thanksgiving, that she wouldn't. We are not where we were. We are not where I would like us to be. We are somewhere in between, careful, tentative. Two women learning to be in the same room with the truth finally sitting openly between us, instead of pressed beneath the surface where we both pretended not to feel it. It is slow. It is uncomfortable. Some days it does not feel like enough. But she turned around, eventually. And I am choosing, not for her, but for myself, because I am the one who has to live in my own chest, to let that count for something. Douglas is what he was going to be regardless. His architecture collapsed under its own weight, the way those structures always do eventually. That part of the story is being handled by people whose job it is to handle it, in rooms I do not need to be in. I have my own rooms now. There is one more thing, one last detail, and it matters more than almost anything else I have told you tonight. In March, 4 months after that Vietnamese food Thanksgiving, Petra came to me with something she had been sitting on since October. Since before the text, since before Ms. Okafor, before CPS, before any of it. She opened her phone. She showed me her camera roll. At my Aunt Patricia's house, at that dinner I had not attended, in the hallway outside the downstairs bathroom, Petra had felt something shift in the air, had recognized it, had remembered everything her mother taught her. And before she texted me, before she did anything else, she had pressed record. 34 seconds. That is how long the recording is. 34 seconds of audio captured on a 17-year-old's phone in a hallway outside a downstairs bathroom in my Aunt Patricia's house on a Sunday evening in October. I have listened to it once. I will not listen to it again. Not because it is unbearable, though it is, but because I do not need to. I have already spent 22 years living in the original. I do not require the recording to know what it contains, what it sounds like, the particular register of that voice, the low, warm, confiding tone that I recognized in Petra's description before she ever pressed play. But the investigators needed it. 34 seconds, handed to the right people in the right format with the right chain of custody, is not nothing. 34 seconds, placed alongside a 22-year timeline, Marcus's note, 2 other women's accounts, and a CPS substantiation, is the difference between a pattern and a case. Douglas Merritt's attorney called it inadmissible, argued about consent laws, about the age of the recorder, about the circumstances of the capture. These are arguments attorneys make. They are paid to make them. What attorneys cannot argue away is the corroboration, the way 34 seconds of audio confirms, in his own voice, in his own cadence, the precise behavioral language that 3 women had been describing for decades without anyone writing it down in a room with authority. The law moves slowly. I will not tell you it moves swiftly, because it does not, and you deserve the truth of that. There are processes still underway that I cannot speak to in detail. There are outcomes still being determined in rooms I am not in and frankly do not want to be in. What I can tell you is that Douglas Merritt did not attend another family gathering after January. What I can tell you is that his name is no longer spoken at my mother's table as though it belongs there. What I can tell you is that the 2 women who came forward, women I had never met, who had been carrying their own weight across their own decades, are no longer carrying it alone. That is not everything, It is not the clean, complete, cinematic resolution that the part of us trained on stories wants it to be. But it is real, and real justice, the kind that actually changes the conditions on the ground rather than simply satisfying the narrative. Real justice is almost never clean. I think about Petra a great deal, not with worry. She is in therapy, she is steady. She is 17 years old and already more fluent in her own interior life than I was at 35. I think about her with something that does not have a clean name, something adjacent to awe. She was 9 years younger than I was when I first tried to say something. She said it to the right person on the first try. She documented before she even knew documentation was what she was doing. She walked back to class after 20 minutes in the bathroom, terrified, and she kept walking. She has my eyes, and she used them. I asked her once, a few months after everything, whether she was angry at Douglas, at the family, at the years it had taken for any of this to move. She thought about it for a long time, the way she thinks about everything, and then she said, "I'm not angry, Mom. I'm just done being the one who keeps the secret so everyone else can be comfortable." 17 years old, my daughter. She handed me back something I had spent 22 years trying to locate in myself. And she handed it to me in a single sentence, the way you'd pass someone a glass of water, casually, as if it were obvious, as if it had always been that simple. Maybe it had always been that simple. Maybe the only thing that was ever complicated was the system built around it, the obligations, the architecture, the careful maintenance of everyone's comfort at the direct expense of the truth. Maybe the only complicated thing was believing that keeping the peace was the same thing as being safe. It is not the same thing. I know that now. I have always known it, somewhere below the level of language, in the part of the body that keeps score even when the mind has agreed to stop counting. They are not the same thing at all. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If any part of Renata's story, the kitchen, the dishwater, the hands that did not reach for the dish towel fast enough, if any of that landed somewhere specific in your body, I see you. You do not have to explain what it reminded you of. You do not have to justify how long you stayed quiet, or why, or what it cost you. Some rooms were simply never safe. And building your silence around that fact was not weakness. It was survival. And survival is not nothing. Survival is, sometimes, everything. But Petra showed us something this story. She showed us what happens when a girl is handed the vocabulary her mother was never given. When someone loves her precisely and specifically enough to say, "You are allowed to trust what your body already knows." Pass that on to whoever in your life needs it. That is the whole assignment. That is all. If this one found you at the right moment, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Leave a comment below. I read every single one, and this week I especially want to hear from you. And if you are not subscribed yet, well, you have been here this long. You know exactly what we do here. Around here, we don't just survive it, we understand it. And then, we let it go. She didn't win by fighting louder. She won by knowing more. Remember that. I'll see you by the fire.